Hello, friends. This is Dave Herewith, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a little chat about a phenomenon that we in the classical music world encounter rather frequently, and you will too if you're just starting out collecting recordings or getting into classical music, and that's this. Artists who allegedly hate making recordings but do it anyway. Of course they do. They do it for many reasons. They do it for the money. They do it for the attention. They do it sometimes because they have no choice. It's just a contractual obligation, but they do it. And that's the point I want to make. Let's talk, first of all, about the differences between recordings and concerts, because this comes up in conversation, and I frankly don't understand it. A recording of a piece of music is a completely independent object. It has nothing to do with a live performance, even if it originates in a live performance, because a live performance is a spontaneous event, and a recording is fixed for all time. And as far as I'm concerned, they have nothing to do with each other. Nothing whatsoever. A recording is a perfectly legitimate way to experience a piece of music, but it's not a live concert, obviously, and it shouldn't even be compared to one. It's not an apples and oranges or zero-sum game kind of thing. It is an apples and oranges thing, pardon me, but it's not a zero-sum game. The fact that recordings exist doesn't mean that they're better or worse than live recordings. They just exist. They are. And you can like them better or you can like them less. There are many recordings of many works that I enjoy better than any live performance I've ever heard. On the other hand, I enjoy live performances because going to a live performance is thrilling. Even if the performance sucks, it's thrilling. It's a lovely night out. I have a good time. When we listen to recordings, we're making comparisons. We're evaluating. When we go to a live performance, our brains half the time just shut off and we enjoy the spectacle. Recordings, in a way, are a purer experience of a piece of music because you don't see anything. And I think that's great. I don't like to look at artists performing, and I was one of them. I played percussion. I mean, I enjoy watching when I'm there, of course. But in terms of experiencing a piece of music, to just use your ears is, I think, a healthier exercise and can actually bring you closer to the music than being in a live performance can. It compensates, or let's put it that way. It's a compensatory aspect of the experience of the piece of music because you have to focus just on what we hear. I do believe that in general, my experience, plenty of experience of this, is that even hardcore classical music people are unwilling to credit the evidence of their ears. We all are. We are trained to use all of our senses, and they all provide input, of course, but we doubt ourselves when we are robbed of, for example, vision to accompany an auditory sensation. We want to see what we hear, in other words. And that's true in music. It's definitely true in music. And so when it comes to recordings, I think a lot of people find them less satisfying because the visual element, quite simply, is lacking. And they don't know what to do with themselves. People don't know what to do with themselves when they're listening. You know, what do? You vacuum, you knit, you twitch, you trim your nails, you can scratch yourself. I mean, what do you do with your hands? What do you do with your eyes? What do you do with the rest of your senses when you're just listening? One of the most difficult things to try and convince people when it comes to talking about classical music, particularly because it's long, and some of it's very big, is that you can sit for 45 minutes or an hour and a half and just listen and do nothing else but listen. And the music provides all of the entertainment and attention-grabbing information you need, and it all comes into your ears. People don't believe that. They don't really believe that. I believe that. I know it's true. But it takes some training. It takes some unlearning. You have to be able to know what you're listening to and understand it and look forward to it. That's very, very hard. It's very difficult. And I don't mean to in any way denigrate people who have problems with it, because everybody does. We all do. Part of becoming a serious music listener is learning to become a serious listener, period. Learning to trust these, your ears. So that's a general point I want to make. And so when it comes to recordings, you shouldn't even compare them to live concerts because they're a different way, a different medium through which we can encounter great music, and a perfectly valid one. So what does this have to do with the artists in question, the artists who don't like to make recordings? Well, I can understand why a lot of artists don't like to make recordings. It's a pain in the ass to make recordings. It's uncomfortable. A lot of artists need the stimulation of an audience in order to do what they feel is their best work, which means live recordings as often as not. Leonard Bernstein, for example, in his later career, wanted to use live recordings as the basis for all of his releases with patch-up sessions to fix the problems or the things that went wrong. Because he was a supremely comfortable and great recording artist, he could do the patch-up sessions and not interrupt the flow of the music. He could do it. Some artists can't. Some artists just can't do it. And if they can't do it, okay, it's legitimate. They can't do it. So you release some live recordings or other things like that. But I'm talking about a different batch. I'm talking about the ones who really disdain recordings. First of all, they don't like to hear themselves. They may be so insecure or so, narcissistic that they can't even tolerate the sound of their own work. There are people like that. A lot of singers are like that because you don't hear yourself when you sing. You can't hear your own voice. You don't hear what it sounds like in a room. And then they hear it. They go, ah! That happens. It happens. And it's fair when it happens. So you have to kind of get around it. But I'm thinking of conductors like Fort Wengler or Chelabadaki or those people, Mravinsky, the ones who just refused to make recordings because they had some weird, snotty, antediluvian view of technology as evil and as something that takes the epiphenomena, if you're a Chelabadaki, out of the music and renders it cold and lifeless and dead. I mean, first of all, it's bullshit. I mean, if they have that view, fine, let them have that view, but it's bullshit. Second of all, what wound up with so many of those artists is that, of course, the recordings got released anyway because they had a value, or at least they used to have a value. Now, of course, recordings have no value. But back in the day, they had a value, and people would buy them. And so it's important to also make a distinction with those artists who, for whatever ridiculous reason, thought that technology was evil and recordings were somehow anti-musical. It's important to make the distinction between recordings that they authorized, which they did, and those which they did not. Now, of course, Chelabadaki authorized nothing. He authorized videos, of course. Fascinating, isn't it, that someone would not permit the pure sound of the music to represent them absent visual images. I think that's just extraordinary. And it just goes to show how demented and screwed up he was in his thinking. But with others, their reputations have been besmirched, in my view, by the cultish following of those who went to grab air checks, broadcasts, things that got released that they never would have authorized had they been alive. Fort Wengler is the best example of that because the man had standards, and 90% of his recordings don't represent those standards, and so but they're out there, and people are marketing them and merchandising them, and I can understand their fear of the commercial aspect of the business as being inimical to art. It's not inimical to art necessarily. I mean, commercialism can be wonderful for art. It depends on the art and depends on how you commercialize it. But it can be really bad for their art. And Fort Wengler knew that. Some of these people are very careful. They're pianists too. Was it Grigory Sokolov? People like that. They only make live recordings. They don't want to be in the studio. The truth of the matter is that if an artist does not like to make recordings or does not want to make recordings. And there are some who only wanted to make recordings. Remember Glenn Gould? He gave up concertizing and only made recordings. If they don't want to do it, they shouldn't be pushed to do it. I mean, we don't need them. We don't need to hear this stuff. We don't need to hear, and we particularly don't need to hear the attitude of artists who say, well, I don't listen to my recordings. I don't care for making recordings. I don't like my recordings. I interviewed an artist, I've talked about this once, who said he quote, didn't give a shit about any of his recordings. And I was appalled because he's making them and people are buying them. I mean, artists owe their public something. They owe their public at least a modicum of respect, number one. You don't crap on the people who are giving you money to supposedly enjoy your art. You treat them nicely. You treat them with decency. You treat them with respect. And part of the way that you treat them with respect is by accepting or admitting that the recordings that you make, the exemplars of your work that are put out there before the public, are legitimate. And you should be proud of them. I mean, if you don't want to listen to them for other reasons, because you don't want to hear your little mistakes or because your opinion of how you play a work has changed enormously over the years, okay, fine. It's nobody's business whether you play your records or don't play your records. But to make it a public statement, to tell people that they were fools, effectively, to buy your recordings, I think is a horrible thing. And the classical music industry is the only art industry, I think, where it's true, where artists have this feel that they have the right to disdain their own public. I mean, could you imagine in pop music and rock music with, we just dropped a new album. We don't want anyone to buy it. It's not representative of what we do. How long would they survive? And that's right, because if you are performing before the public, whether you're making recordings or only giving live recordings, if you are offering yourself to the public in any form, in any medium, you have certain obligations to that public. And you have, first and foremost, an obligation to respect and be kind to that public and to let them feel that you're grateful for paying attention to you and to your art. So I am deeply suspicious of artists who repudiate their recordings publicly, who give public utterance to their disdain for recordings, which is a disdain for their public. That bothers me tremendously. And it bothers me when artists re-record repertoire constantly. It's part of that. It's a corollary to that, because how many versions of the same thing by the same person should any of us have to put up with, number one? And number two, why didn't they make up their minds the first time? Why didn't they do their best work the first time? Why don't they say, I'm done with this because this is representative and I appreciate the fact that other people like it, and that's okay. I don't have to do it over and over again. Of course, they're playing the same music over and over and again. And so their opinions of it are going to change. And then, of course, their most current view of it is the one that they're going to regard as the most legitimate, especially if they're serious artists. Because, of course, however they feel on the night is their most 100% committed version of the work. That's a given too. But they need to understand that when you're making a product, a commodity, which is fixed for all time, you damn well better be proud of what you do. You have an obligation to be proud of what you do. And so a lot of the old school is supposed to be an old school thing. Remember, these old conductors, they didn't understand recording. They didn't like recordings, but that's also bull. Toscanini loved making recordings. He did. He enjoyed listening to his broadcasts and deciding what was going to be released and what wasn't going to be released. And he thought, gee, a lot of this is pretty good. And it was. Bruno Walter, who was as old as, the Hills, enjoyed making recordings. Pierre Monteux made beautiful recordings. It has nothing to do with how old they were or how old the technology was at the time, or any of those things. There are no excuses. I don't tolerate excuses, and you shouldn't either, from artists who say that their recordings aren't representative, or they're this, or they're that, or they don't like making them, and they hate commercialism, and they hate the industry, and they hate nonsense. If you are part of the industry, if you're in the industry, if you release recordings, then be a mensch. I guess that's the bottom line. Act like a human being and be proud of what you've done, and give your audience something to feel good about, because they're supporting you and they care. And so you should care too. That's my advice to artists and to listeners. Don't take any crap from these people. Just don't. You are in the driver's seat as the listener. They exist to please you. And if you aren't pleased, then speak up. Let them know that you're not taking any guff. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.